All right, let's continue talking about the Gaza Strip, and let's bring in another panel right now. We have Colonel Cedric Leighton, retired from the U.S. Air Force and the president of Cedric Leighton and Associates, out of our D.C. Bureau. Out of the L.A. Bureau, Christian Whiten, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, former senior advisor to the U.S. State Department and principal of D.C. International, joining us from our Los Angeles Bureau. Colonel Leighton, first, I want to start with you. We're talking about an air campaign on the Gaza Strip. It seems limited. What can they get done in terms of airstrikes, in terms of shutting down the ability of Hamas to fire rockets out of the Gaza Strip?
Well, Mike, it depends on their targeting capabilities, and really what they're looking at doing is going after the various batteries of missiles that are out there. The Israelis have looked at the Fajr 5 missile. That is the Iranian missile that Hamas has been using, the one that has basically threatened Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. It's a longer-range missile, and that is an area that they've worked in terms of getting at the long-range missile. It becomes very, very important for the Israelis to strike at those. So what they've done is they've tried to target those, and they think they've eliminated most of them. But there are always some surprises out there, and because of the illicit supply lines that go from Iran to Hamas in the Gaza Strip, there are going to be a lot of problems targeting those areas, and it's going to be very difficult also from a civilian and collateral damage perspective as well.
Now, you talk about collateral damage, and something that could really end this conflict on the side of Hamas is if there is a strike with really profound civilian casualties. And when you're talking about the Gaza Strip, it's not big enough to run a marathon from top to bottom, and it is packed with 1.8 million people. You're going to have civilian casualties. You could even have bad information that intentionally leads you to civilian casualties. So Colonel, how does Prime Minister Netanyahu avoid this tremendous pitfall that's waiting for him?
Well, he has to be very careful because it really depends on the targeting solutions, and so the intelligence has to be ironclad, and intelligence is, as you know, never a perfect art. And when it comes to the targeting solutions that they get, they have to use the right kind of weaponry so that it minimizes the area that they go after. They also have to make sure that they go after areas that are considered to be real targets. In other words, not civilian centers, not hospitals, not schools. But the problem is that Hamas is going to use those areas, especially mosques and other institutions, as a means of cover. So it becomes very, very hard for them to do it from the air. The best solution would be a combination of airstrikes and special operations strikes.
But then you put the Israeli soldiers at risk, and you create another whole problem with the political pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu with his constituency. And speaking of political pressure, I want to bring in Christian Whiten right now, because I'd like to talk about the broader threat that Israel faces right now. As everybody knows, they're surrounded by unfriendly enemies. The peace accord with the Egyptians is not as solid as it was, certainly not back in the early 80s. And then you've also got this element where the Syrians have recently fired into the Golan Heights, which is in the very northern part of Israel, and Hezbollah is getting their directives from Iran. They're unpredictable. So in the event that the Israelis go into the ground, what's the likelihood that we're going to unleash something in the north?
Well, Mike, I think that, you're right to point out the hand of Iran in all of this, not just coming from the north, but frankly Hamas, too, where all of the action has been this last week. Hamas, is trained by Iran, it's equipped by Iran, it's funded by Iran. It never would have taken the steps it's taken without the go-ahead from Iran. And, often in America we look at this and we see all these bad actors in the Middle East, Hezbollah, Hamas, other elements in Lebanon. You have the Iranian government itself with its nuclear ambitions, but the common denominator is that Iranian regime. So, it's very important, I think, for Israel, which is being tested at this time by Iran, that just, feels a very open door to do what it wants. I think it sees in the election results in the United States proof positive that there is no plausible threat of force against Iran, at least not from the U.S. So Israel, has to act in a humane way, essentially, in retaliating for these very egregious actions against it, but also has to push back hard on Iran and signal Tehran that it's not willing to roll over, whether it's for missiles coming into its neighborhoods from Gaza or whether it's the overall nuclear program.
And to bring the viewers into some of the intricacies of this, if you remember when Hamas was elected to power in the Palestinian territories, they maintained their charter that said Israel must be destroyed. So the Western world cut off all funding. The Palestinian territories are entirely aid dependent, so the Palestinian semi-state went broke immediately, and that is when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and the rest of the mullahs in Iran opened the purse strings, opened their arms, and welcomed the Sunnis of all people into the Shiite nation with all of this money. And now they have another proxy in Hamas in the Gaza Strip. So that being said, as we're talking about negotiations in Cairo, what can be done to make the moderates, the Fatah party, which is not loyal to Iran, somehow relevant in these discussions?
It's very difficult so far. As you point out, Gaza is controlled completely by Hamas. There was one election one time, and after that they dispensed with the niceties of democracy. Basically, you know, we should feel sympathy for the Palestinian people who live under this tyranny in Gaza. I think any apparent attempt to replace Hamas as the ruler of Gaza would be met with very difficult circumstances, shall we say. You know, the only people who really have pressure here, who have a seat at the table, are others within Islam and Islamist circles. Certainly Egypt, which has, sort of unfortunately good relationships with Hamas and growing relationships, could bring pressure to bear. I think it's important from the West. You have people who say that we need to put pressure on Israel and that we need to bring all the parties to the table. The parties don't currently exist to form some lasting agreement because Hamas is backed by Iran, because Hamas is committed utterly to the destruction of Israel. And then, of course, on the other side, you have Hezbollah. Hezbollah is the successor to the Islamic Jihad, took Americans captive in Lebanon in the 80s. So really, you don't have the forces here. We need to wage political warfare against the Islamists in Gaza if we ever want a long-term agreement. But you don't do that through diplomats, whether they're American or Israeli diplomats. You have to work through Islamic circles to do that. And we need to have a partner to do that. Egypt seems increasingly unlikely to be that partner. Maybe behind closed doors, Turkish President Erdogan would be more willing to be a partner in this. But so far, there's nothing in sight that looks like any long-term agreement could be coming.
Yeah, and Erdogan has come down so publicly and so strongly against the Israelis, particularly for the last Gaza conflict. Colonel Leighton, let me bring you in. You talk about the Gaza conflict. Everybody wants a resolution. It seems there's only two solutions. One, you could negotiate something in Cairo, or there's going to be a ground invasion. Is there any way to break the back of Hamas, stop the, well, even without breaking the back of Hamas, stop the rocket fire short of a ground invasion?
I think the only way to do it is with really precise targeting of each of these battery sites. The problem is they're very mobile, and so it becomes a really, really hard thing to do. So is it a probable course of action? Yes, it is a somewhat probable course of action, but it has to be done with other things. And I only see it being done in concert with a ground invasion, unfortunately.
And it seems that since the Israeli pullout from the Gaza Strip, their ability to gather intelligence has been decreased significantly. It's not the same thing as the West Bank, where they learn about the bombers before they come across the wall. Across the wall. When you're talking about the Gaza Strip, Israelis don't go in there unless they go in heavy.
That's right, and it's one of those situations where, because of that dearth of intelligence, it becomes highly unlikely that they will use a targeted campaign from the air, or only from the air. They will use air as a means of achieving their ends, but it will not be the only means. Now, they will use targeted strikes, such as drone strikes, like they already did, of course, to precipitate this. But it is going to be a situation where you look at each of the possible military outcomes with this, and the only way that they can bring anybody to the negotiation table is by really threatening to increase the blockade, and then, of course, by threatening to use military force, and in this case probably actually using military force. And that brings with it its own set of problems, just because of the urban nature of Gaza and the fact that it is so small and so densely populated.
Christian, it seems that the only organization that is benefiting from this at all is Iran right now. Do you disagree?
Nope, I think that's right. Again, they've been pushing on an open door. If you go back through their history, I mean, we have this now where their proxy armies are at war with our ally Israel. Go back just to the last decade, they were responsible for hundreds, perhaps thousands of the American casualties that we incurred in Iraq, not just because they sold arms to the people who killed our guys. They actually were involved directly in that. Go back to the decade before that. So, you know, it's just a really long history of Iran since 1979, misbehaving atrociously, engaged in acts of war against not only Israel, but against the United States and getting away with it. So far they're benefiting. You know, I think it could be good if they had some very strong pushback. There are a couple of signs out there that are positive in English paper, for example, in the Gulf English language paper, coming out and saying that, you know, they're sympathetic to the Palestinians, but Hamas doing the wrong thing and starting this war. So if you can create divisions within Islamism, there could be some benefit here, but hard to see too many positive signs at this point.
Yeah, and while we have the world focused on what's happening in the Gaza Strip, we have America certainly focused on what's happening on Capitol Hill. The Iranians continue rather aggressively to try to get confident with their nuclear enrichment, which takes them a little bit closer to the bomb. And we are out of time, but I want to thank you gentlemen for joining me. That was a very interesting panel. I wish we had more time. And that's a wrap for On the